I think it's important to address the fact that we have, as a society, we've started overusing the word trauma, and that's meant that it's lost some of its oomph. It's become very watered down. We might talk about just having a bad day as traumatic. So the word trauma comes from the Greek, like so much of our language, and it means wound. And initially, trauma has been used to talk about a physical wound. So if you're ever watching a hospital drama, you'll hear people talking about the trauma unit, and you've got people with stab wounds and gunshot wounds and broken bones going into the trauma unit because something has been broken. So we can understand, I think correctly, we can understand the word trauma to mean break. And in order to use trauma correctly, there really does need to be a break of some sort. Otherwise, it needs a different word. It's not just stress. Something has broken. It was in the 1800s that trauma started being studied as something psychological, that it wasn't just physical. One of the main people studying trauma was Freud. He studied women who were suffering from abuse, and he used the word hysteria. But everything that he described about hysteria, it aligns with trauma theory that would emerge around the world wars. So he described them as being emotionally dysregulated. They were just completely unable to ground themselves. Even the people who were highest up in the military, the people who had the best reputations, were also suffering from trauma. So eventually it had to become acknowledged that post-traumatic stress disorder could happen to anybody. Trauma could be caused by things that were not physical, by acts that were not necessarily a threat to life. Simply being a medical worker in a hospital, looking at people who had been shot could traumatize you. You know, it didn't have to be somebody was shooting next to you. And so the idea about what was trauma started to grow as something that could be psychological and not physical. What wasn't done was that the word hysteria was not replaced with the word trauma. People have acknowledged the links between what was written about hysteria and what was written about trauma, but they never said, hey, look, actually, this is what that is. Women might be traumatized too. I bring this up because I think a lot of what we see as traits of autism. I'm not saying autism is trauma, but a lot of what's presenting is, I think, responses to too much stress that has gotten to the point that it's caused a break. And so I want to come to a modern understanding of trauma, that we as human beings have a window of tolerance for tolerating stimuli, stress, different things happening throughout our day, and we should be staying in this window. But if everything's okay, we're staying here in the window. Now, if things aren't okay, we get pushed outside. We go into the overstimulated hyperarousal zone. Common trauma responses are understood as friending, or another word for that is fawning. I think more people are using fawning these days. Or fight, flight, freeze. These are commonly known. Down here in the hypoarousal, we have flop. So I've created some autism words, or not, I haven't created the words, but I've applied some of common autism words to these trauma responses. So fawning, I explain this as you're trying to avoid being hurt by being likable. This is fawning. We're trying to get along. We're trying to fit in. We're trying to think about what does the other person want and how can I make them happy? And this is where I think that trauma becomes a very fitting term for these difficulties, because it becomes a fragmented sense of self. Our sense of who are we and how do we understand ourselves does become broken, or rather develops broken. I use terms like other referencing and self-referencing, and a lot of times children who are whose environment is completely out of alignment with who they are, the mirroring just isn't there, they will become other referencing. They will start deferring to other people's ways of thinking. You're in a hyper-aroused zone, constantly trying to figure out what is needed here, what is needed here, what is needed here. But often in school, we don't get these messages. We don't get told how it's okay to have our feelings. We're getting told how to sit still and conform to what's needed. We internalize societal norms without being able to decide when something is dangerous for us. So this lack of being able to identify our boundaries that we need. Sometimes I do know of instances where people have been assaulted, and what was experienced as what was the assault, which was experienced as traumatic as anyone would think, was similar to things that would other people wouldn't identify as traumas. Okay, but this is what it felt like to be sitting in school. So if I was supposed to sit in school, why is this act bad, but that act was okay? So it is very important that people are able to say, no, actually, I'm really not okay in this environment. I'm not okay with this. No matter how normal it seems to anyone else, people need to be able to say for themselves, this is wrong. So impacts would be not being able to have your own boundaries, not being able to know what you want for yourself, living in a state of hypervigilance, extreme anxiety, and poor health. There's research that autistic people tend to have, on average, a 10-year shorter lifespan than non-autistic people. The main reasons for this is heart disease, cancer, and suicide. These are things that can result from a depleted nervous system. So it is having a really difficult impact. One of the articles now I'm going to send after today's lesson, I'll put it in an email and get that to everybody, is called, Are We Giving Autistic Children PTSD from School? I've emailed the woman who wrote this, and I asked her if she was autistic because her insight was amazing. She's an autistic psychologist. I always look for literature written by autistic people. Her article discusses the school environment and how conformity is sort of the main goal. I've talked to teachers who, also express frustrations about how much pastoral work they're being expected to do. And they're like, but I have all these things I'm supposed to do. And I get it, because I think the problem isn't with the teachers. The problem is with the system that's been set up to look a certain way, that privileges a certain way of working. And it's not a good system for a lot of us neurodivergent people. It can be cause quite a lot of trauma in our developing sense of self. And that can cause problems with setting boundaries later in life and getting our needs met and communicating those needs to others and having healthy relationships. It can create a lot of problems that don't need to exist just because we work differently. What sort of impact do you think it has for people in their adult life? So it's not just children, because children are children for a little bit. We're adults for so much longer. So this treatment that we get in school, this need to conform and this being seen as maybe naughty or incapable if we're not conforming, what do you think is the impact on us as adults? Maybe you've watched this impact take place. Maybe you work with somebody or you've experienced it.